How to achieve harmony with nature in urban environment. Hi, my name is Marcin Żebrowski and welcome to the newest episode of Urbcast, my podcast about urbanism, architecture, cities and many more. And today we will discuss about the nature, the plants, and its role in urban development. We will discuss the Metropolitan Metaculture, which is a philosophy that aims to create inclusive and sustainable environments in urban areas through innovative planting design. The MIMI approach incorporates all forms of plant cultivation and aims to include people in the transformation process towards a greener world. The founder and author of Metropolitan Metaculture and my guest today is Morten Leicht Jeppsen, who is the urban horticulturalist. Morten is a landscape architect and permaculture specialist with over 20 years of experience in planting design, urban farming, and nature-based systems. He holds a landscape architecture degree from the University of Copenhagen and has worked at various nurseries and architecture firms, including SLA, as a planting specialist. He has a strong knowledge in climate adaptation, permaculture, and mediating plant use. Today we talk about what is the Metropolitan Metaculture and how it differs from traditional urban green spaces, what inspired Morten to develop Metropolitan Metaculture, what is the goal behind it, and how can we achieve the harmony with nature through progressive and performative plantings based on natural and circular systems. Welcome to the newest episode. Let me just start, Morten, with saying that it's very good to see you again after a couple of years.
Yes.
We managed to meet. I would be pretty surprised if you remembered, but I was studying in Lund. I was studying the sustainable urban design, and you've been one of the guest lecturers. Do you remember coming to Lund?
Yes, I remember coming to Lund, but that was at my prior job while I was working at SLA.
Yes.
So it was once a year I was actually giving lectures in Lund. So that's true.
I hope that we can also mention some of the approach you had at SLA back then, because you've been working there for a couple of years actually, and this is how I first met you when you were presenting an interesting project of a landscape made next to a bank headquarter. But what I remembered the most is that you've been showing us pictures of kind of before and after. So you've been emphasizing how important it is for the plants to have the time to grow. I think that you need to be very patient. So do you know how those trees look like right now? Is it like a ready product or it will be never ready product?
You talk about the trees at SEB Bank now.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. It depends a lot on how you perceive it. First of all, it is an SLA project, so I think that's worth to mention. But that project actually came up around the time when I started at that company, where I had like 10 years of experience, and also saw the company growing to the extent that they are today with more than 100 people. That's an amazing transformation, and that's also the case for the specific project here that you mentioned. SEB Bank, that is, as I perceive that specific project, what is unique about the project is very much that if you take away the building, you will actually miss part of the landscape. But if you take away the landscape, you also miss part of the building. And that's kind of unique with that specific project. And what they also did in that project is that they actually ensured the root volume to be able to extend underneath the concrete. It's in situ concrete on the entire site, and there's actually a parking lot underneath.
So it's actually possible to build in concrete, but also provide a sufficient number of trees and greenery and plants.
It is possible, but if you take a little deeper look into it, you will also see that there's some challenges with this, because when you have these roots of the trees growing underneath, you will also see when they then die, that it will happen eventually. Some trees do die for different reasons. And then if you cut it down, as is the case also in this project, it's really, really hard to replant something new in there. So that's one of the challenges you will also stand with. So it's about thinking the entire way around all these projects, how to both have an idea that fits into an overall concept and make sure that you actually know how to maintain it long term.
Definitely would love to talk about the challenges in a minute, but first I would love to share your background with the listeners of this podcast, because you are not a landscape architect as such, even though you have the landscape architect education from the University of Copenhagen, but you have been brought up among the trees, one can say, because you've been getting your experience in the nursery. You've been the nursery gardener. Could you just share something more about this very particular background that you have?
It is true. I'm not like a strict landscape architect as such. My interest started in plants. And it's just to wrap it all back to my childhood. I was actually this strange guy that didn't want to play soccer. We were just talking about soccer before.
Yes.
I never really played soccer as a kid, and I never really understood what was so interesting about, like having a ball in between two sticks, because I found it way more interesting to look at the flowers that were in the lawn. So plucking these flowers and giving it to my mom, and she called me her flower child. So I actually remember, I really recall doing that since a very early age. And it gave me a very, I would say, calm and pleasant feeling, just being in nature, being in contact with nature and doing something with nature. I actually found the best flower fields for the specific species. Also found a field, I remember, where you had what did they call, like fall clovers. The ones that bring luck. Yeah. They were growing in abundance. I even have found 5 clovers. That was natural mutations.
Double luck.
Yeah, maybe it's a double luck. I don't know. But my mother, she has framed some of them and still having them up hanging. So that's kind of fun. And I did that from a very young age. And I was always very determined, wanted to working outdoors. That's not the case all the time anymore. I started out as a gardener, working in nurseries, learning to know the trees, learning to understand the different cultures, as they're called in the nursery, getting understanding of where can one grow instead of another, and what can they contribute with for us as people and for nature overall. But I also wanted to work with it, so I also fastly understood that you cannot affect so much when you're working in the nursery. Maybe you can affect the plants and so on, but very often you just sell them. And you don't know where they end up. And that's the case still for many nurseries today. They sell a lot of products, sell a lot of plants. They never know where it ends up. Could even be some of the nurseries supplying some of the larger projects that you do here in Larsen, maybe. They wouldn't know that they contributed with that. That's the case sometimes.
So basically, would you say that the stage 1, or maybe it's even stage 0 of every architecture, or landscape architecture, especially project, starts at nursery?
To some extent, you could say so. I would go as far as saying that you could, if you want to be sustainable, then it starts with your suppliers. So if you look at the landscape supply chain, and more specifically softscape, that's where my interest is, and that's all the work that I'm doing. That's within softscape. I want to remove hardscape part. So many excellent, skilled people doing hardscape everywhere. But softscape is this new thing. Not really a new thing, but it's more new that we start to address it and start to talk about it now. And it seems like it's where you want to find a solution for many things. So I'm concentrating on softscape. And as I try to put it, I want to create the sophisticated value to the frame. I mean, sophisticated content to the frame of the architect. So there, my background in gardening also, of course, is a great advantage, because I understand how you produce stuff and how the entire exchanging of values within that environment is. It's not always that you can just plot in what you exactly need from your factory as such, because it's not working the same way, or at least many nurseries are not.
This is why you call yourself not a landscape architect, actually, but urban horticulturalist.
Yeah, but a horticulturalist is basically a gardener, but I'm using this term also to embrace the theoretical part of the entire super broad field, of also a very practical field, I would say. Gardening is extremely practical, but there's so many different techniques, so many different cultures, there's so many different ways of approaching both soil, and it's not only just soil. It should be It should also be treated as a material with respect. It's our ground resource. That's a whole chapter for itself. But then there's also many different ways of treating the plants, and how to work with them, you could say. I mean, like cultivation in its basic form actually means that you take something from nature and start to refine it and make it better in some way or another for some kind of purpose.
I also like the saying I found on your website that as soon as you take nature and start to cultivate it, it becomes culture. I think that this is important to understand that whatever kind of contact and influence we have with the nature, it stops being nature, right, in its purest form.
Yeah, I mean, that's an ever ongoing discussion, I guess. I mean, I'm not a philosopher as such, though I like philosophy. But yes, I would say that you're right on that. Yeah, something happens. And very often now we are working on at MIMI or Metropolitan Metaculture, or just MIMI because it's easier. We actually like to approach a site where we do biological investigations to see what qualities do this site hold already. And then we'd like to put that into a creative process and then see how can we change this to a higher level? How can we contribute to the overall frame with some of the existing values? And how can we make them larger, enlarge them, or put them in a new setting? Or is there something that should contribute to them?
Again, you are kind of one step ahead of designers who would come to a given place and would start having a vision and analysis, because you said that you start with the soil and you start with everything that's there, with the kind of biological analysis. To me, it's really like trying to understand the place in a sensible way.
Yeah, it's the soft values. It's softscape and it's the soft values. It's a more sensible way, you could say so, yes. So it's not the traditional site analysis. It's more, it's a biological analysis where you go more in depth with, here's an interesting found of a single species. Why is it here? Why does that occur exactly on this site? What does it tell us about the surroundings? So, of course, when you work with the grown and the living environment, you should always look at your sun orientation. You should look at your participation. You should look at your neighboring buildings and so on, especially if you are in the urban environment. There's so many factors that are actually influencing your site. And whatever kind of project you will do, you need to think of these different factors, how they affect you. And then also try to see some of them as assets that you can then work with instead of try to desiccate it out or something.
So sometimes it's important not what you build, but what you don't build over, basically. Would you agree?
Yes, I do agree. That's a tough discussion to have with architects.
Always. You could always argue if the most sustainable building is the one that is not built, of course, many things around it. But maybe tell me and the listeners from your perspective, how do you approach the built environment in MIMI? You do work within urban environment.
Yes, and that's because I like the urban environment. I live in the urban realm myself. I live in the city.
Yeah.
But I also love green. I love nature and I love plants. And I have a quite vast knowledge on the subject as well. And I've been lucky to work with it internationally as well. So not only here in Denmark. I always trusted that this is the right thing to do. I mean, like thinking of our green environment to fit into our built environment to some extent. But now it seems that everybody else is also getting that idea. So why not work with all these guys, so to speak?
But I think it's a good tendency that everyone is trying to be up to speed if it comes to those matters.
Absolutely. It is a good thing. And now you can also see the certification systems is actually starting to embrace it. Now it's possible to work with even biodiversity, having a DGNB certification. I mean, that's a very positive fast forward, I would say, on a more green agenda in general, that you start to address it. Because if you have it within a point score system, then people will also aim for it, at least sometimes. So that will put it more and more on the agenda. And you can see there's a lot of stuff going on with life cycle assessments and materials in general right now. We do not only have like biodiversity crisis. There's a crisis on almost any subject now. There's also the sand crisis. And that's due to we are constructing so many houses in concrete. So now islands are disappearing around the world because you want to get your hands on the last sand left. You can't use all of the sand in the desert. So again, you need to start thinking differently, constructing buildings, but you also need to start thinking differently, constructing landscapes. And I would say the biggest game changer is definitely looking into softscape and what opportunities that actually does offer to our society in general.
Can't not ask you this question because we've been discussing about how can you approach the built environment and the projects. And I see that you have, of course, like a very, very big overview, luckily, because you have both this education of landscape designer, landscape architect, but also the horticulturalist. So someone who was spending hours in the nurseries with trees. Do you think that one can be a landscape architect without this vast knowledge about the plants?
That is the case today. Of course you can.
You can.
Yeah, you can, or at least many are.
I've talked with many different landscape architects, and I met those who were like very, very knowledgeable about plants. Yeah. But I also met those who were more into the design, who were more like as urban designers, without any knowledge about the plants. And they both are trained as landscape architects, right?
Yeah, that's true. That is true. It's a quite wide field, I would say.
Yeah.
Landscape architecture is quite broad. If I go back to the team I was studying with at the university in Copenhagen, they're having very different jobs today, though the majority is engaged in the architecture businesses or landscape architecture. But I also do know that not all of them know about plants. And many of them do not even hold like a larger interest in it either. It's a transdisciplinary field. And now I'm just trying to say, I want to work with softscape. I just want to do soil and plants. And there's so many things in that. And it's about making it working under all sorts of conditions, more or less. And there's many different requirements to projects today and many crazy ideas. Sometimes you can just squeeze a little bit in, but other times you can really unfold the full potential. And I believe as long as it makes sense to us, it's worth being on board, because it's better to sell one plant than selling non-plants, how to put it.
Yeah, okay. It is about education as well, I would say. And that's why I really wanted to get your opinion about this topic, about the education as a landscape architect.
It's also a little sensitive topic in some ways, because one thing I've realized working with both architects and landscape architects, and never really had the designer myself in the stomach. I never wanted to be the one doing the overall design.
Yeah.
I do have an opinion and I do see things. I would also say that I'm capable of doing it, but where I'm really different or really make a huge difference or a difference to a project is when I'm working on the softscape part. All the soft values, soil and plants.
You yourself worked as planting specialist, and this is something that you are doing now. So since we already agreed that this is like a very early stage process, I think that you had a chance to observe how it is basically to work with landscape architects, with urban designers, with architects. And I believe you really had this overview of like, how do they approach the projects? And how different it might be sometimes how you approach the project.
Yeah, it's extremely different. I just like to work with the team, so to speak, and then come with the best input to whatever is coming up. What are the possibilities within the framework being set up? I mean, of course, it could be nice to maybe do a park on any plot you could find in the city, but that's not always the case that you set to make a park. You need to have certain amount of floors and blah, blah, blah. I mean, all these functions that you need to fill in and so on. So it's more what is realistic in the context. I love to get that challenge, so to speak, and to see how much green can you actually get out of all this. So sometimes, it unfolds the full potential, and sometimes you get it even better than you expected. And other times, there's a little less to work with. And if there's nothing, then you're out, so to speak. I mean, so that's very much it.
I would like to discuss also the term metaculture, because this is something that you are basing your current work at Metropolitan Metaculture. And I think that it would be great if you could help us to understand the metaculture. Could you say what is exactly the definition of metaculture?
That's a good question. It's a rather versatile subject. I mean, it's quite broad in its definition, but as we perceive it, or as I perceive it, it's culture in its essential form actually is taking something from nature and making it better for a certain purpose. And metaculture is also all of our different cultural forms of agriculture. It's silviculture, that is forests. And then it's also horticulture, of course, that is more around gardening. But then it's also some of the more specialized cultural forms like funky culture or super specialized like electroculture or something.
Could you develop those? What do you mean by electroculture?
Electroculture, yeah, that can actually be two different things. There's two different fields of electroculture. There's one where you on purpose put electricity to your plantings and then they perform differently. But there's also an electroculture approach where you kind of harvest the free energy of the air and use it for your plantings with the north-south directions and different wires of different metals and so on. It's very, very interesting, and I also believe that it has a future. So one is more sci-fi, and the other one is, let's say, more low-tech.
So what you basically do is you try to understand a given site or basically whatever surrounds us and you work with, you try to understand this as a whole. Am I correct with saying that metaculture is just this kind of holistic umbrella to understanding everything that is surrounding us?
Yeah, kind of, but it's also some kind of exchange between cultures, you could say. So prefer to describe it as all the different cultivation forms that you could possibly think of, and then put into the given context and see how much can you actually achieve by looking through the metacultural library, so to speak.
And then you take this approach and you insert that into the metropolitan life, because we are speaking about the urban environment.
Yeah.
And how is that being done?
As I also said before, we like to do our own site analysis that is very much based on the biological existing values and analyze for sun, wind, all the different climatic factors and so on. Anything that basically affects the greenery. So this also means the soil, what kind of soil you have, participation. So it's a natural registration of the given site. And then we want to put that into a creative process where we unfold the potentials of what is found and how could we strengthen any of these different findings, or how could we give it some sort of company of other metacultural approaches.
What's the role of plants in all of this? Because I guess that the point is also to have this innovative planting design in a way. So have a very, very vast understanding of how plants react, how are they made, how are they transported into a site. What is basically the role of planting in those projects and attached to your philosophy? Is that the tool to achieving sustainability, or is there something more behind that?
It's also aesthetics, of course. I mean, working in the urban environment, I believe it is extremely important to also have a focus on your aesthetics. But the way we approach it is more that aesthetics used to be sort of the standard working with plants. I mean, that's the only thing you could sort of discuss when you were addressing something in the landscape. If you were having urban or landscape design, you were only talking about the plants from an aesthetic parameter. And of course, in some cases, they have also been used as architectural lines or something. But I mean, basically has been reduced to only being aesthetics. Now we have realized that there's many different ecosystem services and so on. And one of them that is a hot topic at the moment is biodiversity, of course. So how are the different animal species linked to the different plant species, and how is those plant species, again, related to the soil? How can you use some kind of existing soil and adding soil additives that could be any kind of waste material that is then upcycled by being added to the soil, and also contributing to a microbial life that will then having a better planting, a more robust planting with more species and less bad biodiversity of diseases, but you get this flourish impact that you're seeking for. So it's a bit reverse.
Should biodiversity be a goal or at least a component of every urban design nowadays?
That's a good question. I think that is a really good question.
It's because I hear a lot recently about the biodiversity, and I think it's so good that we are going towards that direction. But if we could think of like an examples that maybe the biodiversity is not this holy grail.
I'm not sure it's always the holy grail. But of course, I like working with the topic, and I also do believe that if you kind of aim for biodiversity in a landscape project, then you have achieved something. That's for sure, because you can't achieve a high level of biodiversity unless a certain amount of factors has also been fulfilled. So there's a lot of check boxes that you could wing off by having biodiversity as a focus. I'm quite convinced of that. But again, I mean, it's not greening your balcony that is saving the planet, so to speak. I mean,
what is that then? It's a broad question.
It's a broad question because it's a lot of our very interesting biodiversity is actually in our forests and our land outside of the cities. But the city offers an environment that is possible of becoming more biodiverse. But you also need to solve many other issues at the same time.
The reason I brought achieving the sustainability through innovative planting design is that you say that the philosophy of MIMI, of Metropolitan Metaculture, is that humans can be just as beneficial and a factor in the ecosystems of the world as we are today destructive. And I couldn't agree more that we tend to develop our cities, and I think that we are still very egoistic human beings. So we are trying to develop everything so it needs to a certain level of our comfort and needs. But here you say the opposite, that you are hoping that humans can be as beneficial and being this factor in ecosystem as we are destructive today.
Actually, I believe we can be, but it's also very human not to be. So that's the case. The reason, it's actually interesting that you mention it. The reason that we're actually saying it is that we're also working with engaging people into projects. So you can have like a list of different events going on in softscape projects that is also then interconnected to how you monitor on biodiversity, for example. That is then also combined with your maintenance of the site. So this idea about people becoming a more positive factor is actually that we would like to give the opportunity to contribute in a positive way through the projects in the urban realm.
But you've also mentioned that greening and putting more plants on your balcony is not the solution.
It's not saving the world that you're doing it, but of course, if everybody did it, but I mean, there's many discussions on all these things. I just want to be realistic. When WWF can go out and say that you could plaster the entire Denmark in asphalt and it wouldn't make any difference for the world's biodiversity, I think it's important to understand that it's to some extent true, but on the other hand, it's also the value of doing something different, of actually doing something nice, of being a nice person. Do you want to be an asshole all the time, or do you actually want to contribute with something positive? I don't believe anybody wants to be an asshole all the time. And it also depends on who is perceiving, of course.
I'm an optimist, so I hope that it's not the case. But I also brought this balcony again into our conversation and also we discussed biodiversity. And I do realize that there is this overall tendency that people are getting, regardless the country, they are getting more and more aware of the role of the greenery, especially in the urban realm. And we do hear more and more about urban gardening and green roofs on the buildings. And also some legislation follows, as in France. So it feels like we are on a good track. But at the same time, are we?
I'm not the right one to answer that. What we can offer is different solutions where you can at least go as far as possible within the given conditions when you talk about softscape. And that's the green sustainability. And if you do that part right, then you have done many things good from the very beginning. And the larger amount of your project that you can make consists of that, the better.
I'm asking you as a horticulturalist, as a plant specialist, is that enough? Do you think that overall it's a good tendency that we have more and more greenery? What would you say, in your opinion, as someone who knows plants really well?
It is a wider question. Of course, if you really want to be sustainable, it also depends on your purpose. Do you want to be sustainable in a way where you want to be self-sufficient? Or do you want to be sustainable on the parameters given in a certification system? There's two very different approaches, I would say, in many ways, but both can learn from each other. Maybe if you want to be self-sufficient, it still makes sense to buy the bread somewhere because you don't want to be self-sufficient on flour, for instance. I know some people that are self-sufficient with vegetables during the entire summer and start autumn, and then they have meat the entire year as well. That's kind of their self-sufficient level. But as they say, it feels like they are self-sufficient all the time. And I find that extremely interesting because then they're not stepping out of society as such, but they like to do some things on their own. And when it comes to a building, it depends on what is the material. Is it made of wood or is it made of concrete? There's some kind of life cycle assessment here that you need to take into account, I guess. But if you look at nature, the investment in having a green facade is the same amount of hours spent or resources spent on that could have maybe been a large garden somewhere else. And I don't say that one is better than the other, but it's very much a matter of focus. What is the aim?
I'm aware that you can't give me the answer on behalf of everyone. And I know that some of the questions were pretty general, but I also want to kind of pick up your brain a little. Let's now come back to something more on the ground and something that you have influence over, because just to summarize your work at Mimi, I feel like you are pretty aligned if it comes your whole process of work, because it's not only the planting, it's not only the concept, but you also have different experience if it comes to schematic design, detailed design, tender and construction, and also management and planting establishment. Could you share an example of your project?
Yeah, I could talk a little about how we work. We're still rather new started, and we are working on actually a quite broad variety of projects, but none of them are completed yet. So to talk about the process is actually more relevant right now, I would say. Yeah, and it's very much about analyzing the existing site, of course. We do have, first of all, collaborators for us is mostly private developers or architects. Not so much landscape architects, but more architects. And that makes a lot of sense to us, and especially working with the certification systems and exploring the possibilities of implementing a level of biodiversity at the same time as creating environment for people in the given context. I would say that on an overall scale actually frames quite well what we're doing, solely doing softscape in landscape. And that also gives a more, interesting border between your collaboration than I have been used to before, where I was doing the entire landscape, also the hardscape and lighting and stuff like that, where now it's solely softscape. And so what I've noticed is that the architects, it's easier for them to come out of the houses, so to speak, and start to have an opinion about landscape. And a lot of landscape is designed by architects. Let's be honest. That's the case. It's not always a landscape architect. Yeah. So what is very often needed is somebody who can actually stand up for the values of the living and organic world, the green, biological values that we have around us. Yeah, so that's what we offer. And that's what we do. For now, it's quite positive collaborations. Yeah.
Do you advise to your collaborators or clients that the investment into plants is the best investment possible?
Very often don't need to say so. I think there's a broad understanding of it's a rather small investment compared to what you achieve. It's not the highest post on the budget, but the issue is more that it tends to come in too late in the projects maybe, or somebody didn't really think of it, or the entire budget was spent on something else. It's not because that it was too expensive what did with the green or in your landscape design. Yeah, so we're trying to offer a qualitative consultancy through the entire phases, as you also mentioned before, starting with the idea and the concept, and then bringing relevant material to the project whenever it's needed through the entire process. And that could be a very, very specific real estate development, could be urban planning, but it could basically also be the backyard, or we are also engaged in some communities actually outside the city that would like to have a green foundation built up around their little community on farms and so on. So that's quite broad field, but it's always bringing the same relevant material to the projects.
And since we talk about the investment and cost, I was wondering, is that possible nowadays to know how much does it cost to plant and then develop a tree? Because we also started our discussion around the process, the trees and the plants that end up growing somewhere in a project, they came from the nursery and so on. And then there is also a cost of maintaining a tree.
It depends a lot on, is it just buying the tree, or is it planting the tree? Is it establishing the tree, or is it also taking care of the tree on more long term? And of course, the most sustainable thing would be that the tree found its way up itself from seed.
Exactly.
Talking about being sustainable.
Not cutting it.
Not cutting it down, no. But then you will figure out if it has the ability to regenerate. And then that's sometimes some kind of character you could actually use. But the rule of thumb is the price of the tree when you buy it is double up if you want to plant it. Then the next phase is the establishment. And that's the first years when the plants, they come from the nursery. They have been nursed to a certain stage. And then they're kind of let out in life afterwards. So they need to adapt to the site. And that usually takes somewhere between 2 to 5 years, depending on if it's whether like huge trees or if it's something that you sow from seed. Or, there's many different plant species and there's many different plant qualities that you could buy them in. A tree that can maybe reach 40 meters of height can be bought somewhere between 20 centimeters or as a seed and up to maybe 15 meters in reality in European nurseries. So it's a tough question because you more or less have all opportunities. The opportunities are out there. They just need to be explored better.
Here I would like to ask you the final question, which will be, I hope, directed also to landscape architects, because I would like to ask you for a book recommendation. Would you have something that would be interesting for landscape architects, but maybe not only?
I don't know if I have something that would be interesting for landscape architects, but for people interested in plants, there's actually an Italian philosopher called Emanuele Coccia, who recently wrote a book called Life of Plants. And this guy, he is on track to something. He's addressing how our entire society actually is built on kind of a misunderstanding of plants because we never really got into them. We were never really presented that plants has this amazing variety as you do see in nature. And that's due to every time you open a child book, then you will see the different animals and you will learn the names of the different animals. But plants is kind of fading away in the background as some sort of one green mass. And people can't really distinguish between them. Maybe but you do know a banana, you do know an orange, and do know an apple and so on. That's because you eat it. But the actual relation to the plants and how they grow and the environment or natural habitats and so on, people absolutely has no clue today, unless they grow up under such conditions where you get this knowledge. Of course, there's many people that has it in different ways. Metaculture again, right? But that's a very good book where he's talking the talk of plants, I would say, in a sophisticated way. So that would definitely be a book recommendation from me.
Thank you very much for this recommendation, Morten. I hope that it will be very useful for the listeners, even if they are not landscape designers, landscape architects, but to everyone who loves plants. I will add the link to the book in the description of this episode. And for now, I would like to say thank you very much for sharing all your knowledge about the plants, about landscape design.
and about the importance of plants, as you also emphasized with the book recommendation.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to meet you and being a part of your program here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to the newest episode with Morten, and I hope that it was useful and informative piece of knowledge about the plants and how can we basically design our greenery, our urban spaces, knowing that the plants are an extremely important component of it, and how can the Metropolitan Metaculture founded by Morten contribute towards that change. If you would like to get to know something more about Morten's work, you can visit his website that I added in the episode's description, and feel free to reach out both to him and to me if you would like to continue this discussion further. Thanks a lot one more time and talk to you soon.